For the past 2 years, I've been making a cozy adventure game where you travel around an island on your own little steam train. And what's the most important thing that a game like this needs? Well, obviously the first thing is a train, but I made the locomotive in the last video. The second most important thing is a rail for the train to run on. After all, you don't see the Flying Scotsman going down the M1 every day, do you? No, trains need a railway to run on, and here is how I built mine. So, we need to build a railway. How do we do this? Well, it's helpful to break it down into the basic necessities, because after all, what is a railway? The absolute most basic thing we could get away with is just a single straight line. It has a start and an end, and the train can move between the points. This is super easy to do in code. You just get the direction from the start point to the end point, and then you just move the train in that direction. But travelling along a single straight line is not very fun at all. So what we need is more lines. Whoa, too many lines. Let's take a step back. The code to move along this line is pretty much the same. You get the direction from the start point to the end point. But when you get to the end of that line, you then get the direction onto the next end point. You can set this up for a really long chain of lines, but there is still one problem. I'll simulate it and I'll see if you can tell me what's wrong. Yeah, that's it. The train shouldn't do this because tracks should have bends. One common way to do these is using Bezier curves. Between 2 points you have a third control point, and the path from the first to the second is determined through some fancy maths. Connect all these up and you get a Bezier spline. These splines are used quite commonly in games where you want something to move along a given path, like roads or roller coasters or, you guessed it, railways. And I did try out using splines, but there's a couple of problems with this. The main thing is that speed isn't always consistent on a spline. The movement is often calculated in normalised distance, and there's no easy calculation for the length of each part of a spline. Freya Holmer has great videos on Bezier curves if you want to know more about this. I know there are spline systems that account for this, but that doesn't fix my next problem, and that splines are often used for single paths. One long path could work for a railway, it could even be one massive loop, but that's not what I want for my game world. If I'm wanting to make a game where you explore the world by foot and by rail, which by the way, I am, then it'll be really boring to travel around the world if that's only limited to going around a single loop every single time. What I need is a path system that's not made up of just one path, but loads of diverging paths that can connect between one another. There's probably some asset or system online that can make it for me, but you know how the saying goes, always reinvent the wheel. Wait, what was that? The saying is don't reinvent the wheel? Yeah, right. Don't reinvent the wheel. Silly. So how I'm going to craft my railway is with pieces and connections. Each piece is, well, a piece of track. They have certain characteristics like position, direction, distance, and angle. At the start and end of each piece, you have a connection. These connections are like the glue that holds the pieces together, and it all slots together like a big railway puzzle piece without having to use any splines. But Ollie, I bet you're asking, how did you get those beautifully curvy tracks? I bet you weren't asking that, but I'm going to tell you. Circles. Every piece that isn't straight acts as though they're hugging the outside of a big circle. Instead of a train simply moving in a single direction forwards, instead it acts like there's a piece of string attaching it to the centre of the circle, and then it rotates around that. All these circles can be different sizes depending on the magnitude of the curve, and relatively easy to use. To do this though, we need to calculate the middle of the circle so that the train can rotate around it. And to do that, I need to get a bit mathematical. We know certain characteristics of a piece such as direction, distance, and angle, and we can use that to calculate the midpoint. The angle is referring to the degrees in which a track piece rotates per its distance. So to get the total angle, you just multiply the angle by the distance. Then you want to work out the fraction of the circle that your piece is taking, so you divide that by 360. You can use that to calculate the circle's circumference by dividing the distance by that figure. And then you can use the equation circumference equals 2 pi times radius to work out the radius. The radius is the distance from the start of the track piece to the centre of the circle, and because you know that the circle is going to be perpendicular to the start of the track piece, you can multiply the radius by the tangent vector of the start piece's direction to get the centre of the circle. Condensing this equation down is actually quite satisfying, and it's not a very long equation, which is kind of funny because it took me quite a few days to figure it out. Now we're offering the same as if we used a Bezier spline system, but the train can move along the track pieces a lot smoother than before. But how do we get this train to move along the track in the first place? All the track's pieces and connections are stored within a track layout, and this locomotive is a track walker. Track walkers keep track of what piece they're on and how far along that piece they are. Every update, the locomotive moves along the track at any speed, and if it is reached at the end of the piece, it goes to the track layout and say, "Hey, I'm at the end of this piece, it says my end connection has this ID, can you get that connection for me please?" Quick note on how it's structured, each piece has an in and out connection, and each connection has an in and out piece. So after getting this connection from the track layout, it then sees whether the piece we have just travelled on is a connection's in or out piece. It then gets the opposite piece, and the locomotive then travels on at that piece. And now that we've covered that, let's move on to the next thing, switching connections. It's nice and all for the train to move along the track, but the player needs some choice on where to go. Imagine you're going down a line and you see a track going off somewhere. You're like, what is that line? Where does that go? Then starts a journey where you explore the area trying to find how to get onto that line and discover what secrets could be along that track. You can't get that kind of gameplay with a single closed loop track. So what we need is connections that have multiple in and out pieces and switches that the player can interact with to change what track they go down. Now the former is pretty easy to do. You just change the in and out connections from single IDs to an array of IDs, and add a property to the connection that tells which ID in the array you are using. Next, to change the track requires a switch. These switches sit beside the connections, and the player walks up to them to change which track is selected. And that's basically the fundamentals of track switching, and it adds an incredible amount of freedom for the player to go wherever they want from the freedom of their locomotive. But, however, after a few months of having this implemented, I started to find the switch really annoying. In order to change tracks, you have to stop your train just in front of the points, get off, pull the switch, get back on the train, and then start up again. If these switches were used very sparingly around the world, then this wouldn't be much of a problem, but that's not what I want. I want all the paths. It's quite jarring to build up your speed and then just as you've started cruising, then immediately have to slam on the brakes so you can change track. Thus, this requires a solution, a way for the player to switch tracks without having to stop or get off the train. The solution I've chosen is this. The nearest switch is found by having a dummy track walker and moving it along the track until it finds a connection that branches off. The train is alerted by this dummy track walker by going, "Hey, there's a switch ahead," and then you get shown a switch display which shows you where the lines go, and the player can freely switch between them remotely. Probably breaking some rules here because the switch is being pulled by nothing but magic, but it makes the train driving a lot smoother experience. Plus, nobody's stopping you from still getting off the train and changing the switches yourself, it's completely up to you. And another issue I had a bit of a problem with is that I can't turn the engine around. If you're like me, you don't want to go everywhere by travelling backwards. A practice like this is very common in engines that have rear cabin windows, and maybe I would add those to the Hayden locomotive, but I like my engine facing the direction they're going. And I want someone to be able to play this game however they want to play it, so I need to add turntables. They're the turny thing. Oh, what did I do? I'd knocked my phone over. It's essentially used to turn engines or rolling stock around, but it can be used to redirect tracks similar to the switch points. To make this work, I did have to create a new type of track piece. This piece has a whole group of connections, and based on what rotation the turntable is at, the in and out connections can be different. You get on, and similar to the switches, you have something pop up on the screen. Press a button to switch, and the turntable turns to the next track. I plan on having these turntables littered about the place, at least mostly at stations, so that the player can turn themselves round at any point they want, or if they just want to go for a little spin. Whee! That's made me dizzy now. Ooh. And that is essentially it for the railway system. It's been really important for me to have this railway system up and running because that is the main part of this game, and so that's why it's taken me over a year and a half just to have this. But there's also a lot you haven't seen yet. Like, I just told you the basics. I haven't even covered how I built a whole editor system just to build the track layout, or how I'm procedurally generating all of these track pieces and optimizing them. I haven't even mentioned how I struggled for days, even weeks, to make the tracks go up and down. But hey, I need to get this video out before the end of the year. But if you are interested in any of the stuff I just mentioned, make sure to let me know in the comments and I'll consider making a whole other video about it. I'd definitely at least like to cover the whole editor system for building the track layout, because that was basically half of the entire job. But anyway, don't forget to wishlist Railway Life on Steam. We're nearing 6,000 wishlists, which is so awesome. I'm also using Blue Sky now if you want to join me on there. It's a pretty fun place so far. But thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next year where I'll be showing a lot more of this game. Bye! Bye!